Each year, City of Lenexa staff prepare a recommended operating budget, which is presented to the mayor and city council for consideration. The city's budget serves as a crucial tool that guides our efforts for the coming year. Over the next few months, the city council will thoroughly review the recommended budget for 2024. This presentation offers an opportunity for you to explore what is under consideration and gain insights into our proposed spending priorities for the next year.
We actively encourage residents to participate in the budget process by providing feedback and asking questions. You can email your questions to budget@lenexa.com or call 913-477-7544. We hope you will join us at our budget open house on August 17th here at City Hall between 5 and 7 p.m. At this event, you can talk to us in person about the city's financial position and what's proposed in the 2024 budget.
This is the agenda for our presentation. First, we'll give you an overview of how we developed the recommended budget. We'll take a quick look at an economic outlook for the future, review our long-standing budget principles, share some key elements of the recommended budget, as well as some revenue and expenditure projections, and finally some fund forecasts before we talk about next steps in this budget process. The process of preparing a recommended budget for the city is lengthy and challenging. We're really fortunate in Lenexa to have a talented team of finance professionals who do this work for the city. I want to say special thanks to Nate and his team, including specifically Deputy CFO Nathan Mole and Senior Budget and Financial Analyst Justine Kubicki for their work on developing the recommended 2024 budget. The process that leads to the adoption of the city's budget each year begins with city staff developing a recommended budget. First, an overview of the recommended budget is presented to the mayor and city council at a public meeting. And at a second public meeting a few weeks later, more details about staff's recommendation, including review of major changes to individual department budgets, will be presented as well. Throughout both of these meetings and thereafter, staff will answer the governing body's questions about the recommended budget, and we will seek their feedback on the recommendations. This all occurs before the recommended budget moves forward to public hearings. We'll share the calendar for all of these meetings at the end of this presentation, but please know that at any time we appreciate your questions and feedback, which can be submitted by email to budget@lenexa.com. Each year, the recommended budget is developed beginning in the spring, with staff's recommendations being finalized mid-year and the official budget not being adopted until fall. This means that we have to make certain assumptions and projections about the city's finances and how they will fare throughout the remainder of the current year. As Nate will talk about later in this presentation, we are always conservative in those assumptions because it's always better to do better than we expect than to do worse than expected and face budget shortfalls. With that in mind, let's take a look at how we ended last year, 2022, and what has happened so far in 2023 and the impact that will have on our current year, 2023 budget. As you can see, 2022, we ended in a very strong financial position. We had strong sales and use tax collections, and we ended with general fund reserves of 43%. In addition, all expenditures were within the budgeted amounts for 2022. That strength in revenue has really continued into 2023. We've seen strong sales and use tax collections up as much as 10%. Franchise fees, primarily on gas, are also up significantly in 2023, up 28%. And property tax collections are up 5%. This all leads to increases in general fund reserves. The result is that the budget we adopted for 2023 was more conservative than what will actually occur this year. So as we prepare for the FY24 budget, we'll take another look at the 23 budget with the knowledge that we have about how we ended 22 and how we started 23, and we create a revised 23 budget estimate, which gives us really a more realistic comparison for the 2024 recommended budget. So as you can see here, the original budget, which was adopted by the City Council for 2023, was a little over $204 million. That included $144 million in expenditures and a little over $60 million in reserves. With what we know about how revenues have come in the latter part of 22 and the beginning of 23, our revised budget, which we believe is a little more realistic picture of how our financial position of our financial position for 2023 would be $224.7 million. This includes $153.8 million in expenditures, and that nearly all of the $9.8 million in increased expenditures that you see there is transfers from reserves, which will actually be used to pay for capital projects. There's also a $10.7 million increase in reserves, which is, again, the result of those revenues coming in better than we projected. But those dollars do go directly to reserves, which were required by state law to include in our budget, but which will not be spent. So now we'll take a look at high-level numbers relative to the recommended 2024 budget. We're recommending a total 2024 budget of $224.7 million, including $154.3 million in expenditures and $70.4 million in reserves. Now this is an increase, as we just saw, of $20.6 million over the adopted 2023 budget of $204.1 million. But again, the revised 23 budget estimate is shown here, and as you can see, the recommended 2024 budget is less than a 1% increase over the revised 23 budget. A few of the budget highlights that I wanted to review for you. Our total estimated 2024 assessed valuation is $1.72 billion. That is a growth of $110 million approximately over the 2023 assessed valuation, or about 8.8%. Of that, $24.5 million is attributable to new construction or growth in the community. And just a reminder, this number is not final until October or November of this year, so this is an estimate based upon information we've received from Johnson County. The recommended mill levy for the 24 budget is 27.372. That's a 0.75 mill reduction and is the 6th consecutive year that we have reduced the mill levy. Nate will show you the history of that in his presentation. And just a note, property tax, which is what this mill levy represents, accounts for about 43.6% of the city's total revenues. We are recommending no changes to user fees, franchise fees, or the city's stormwater service charge. And we are recommending the addition of 6.5 FTEs, or full-time equivalents, essentially 6.5 new employees. This includes 3 positions in the fire department, which will allow the department to increase their minimum staffing on each shift, and 1 position each in community development, in the police department, and in the municipal services department, and finally a 0.5 increase in human resources. That brings the total authorized FTEs, including these new positions, to 559.66. This is a page in our budget book which illustrates how you can calculate your city taxes. City taxes are only a portion of the total taxes that our residents pay. And this slide illustrates how that calculation can be done, and can be found on page 14 of the budget document. The bottom line is that residents pay $26.23 per month for each $100,000 in home value. Or the owner of an average Lenexa home would pay about $115.33 per month for the services they receive from the city of Lenexa. This slide includes a representative list of the city services that our residents receive for the $115.33 per month. This includes care, maintenance, sweeping, and snow plowing of over 830 lane miles of roads, over 175 miles of storm pipe, over 200 stormwater BMPs, and 34 developed parks totaling 887 acres. It also includes all of the maintenance and care of 45 miles of trail and the 3 outdoor pools, not to mention police and fire protection and numerous other services, and the facilities that are required to house all of these services. Our residents give us very high marks in citizen satisfaction surveys for the services we provide. In fact, we ranked above the national average in all 54 areas that were assessed in the citizen survey. In our last survey, which occurred in 2021, 72% of our residents were either satisfied or very satisfied with the value they receive for their tax dollar from the city of Lenexa. That's up 2% from 70% in 2019 and compares to 60% elsewhere in the Kansas City Metro and 44% nationally. This is a reminder that the city tax accounts for really only a portion of our residents' total property tax levy. In 2022, city tax, shown in blue, ranged from 22% to 25.1% of a resident's total property tax mill levy, and that depended upon which school district they were located. And in each case, the school levy, shown in red, accounted for the largest portion of the total property tax levy. These are the city's guiding principles, which were adopted by the City Council as a part of the 2022 budget. And throughout the budget document, we have reported alignment with these guiding principles through key performance indicators and also within the fund budgets themselves. More importantly, we keep these principles in mind as we have developed the 2024 recommended budget for the governing body's consideration. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nate.
Thank you for that overview, Becky. Before we dive into the details of our fiscal year 24 recommended budget, I wanted to look at our economic outlook and the environment that we operate in. Our recent economy over the last couple of years, we've seen housing valuation increases to the tune of 13% last year and 11% this year in the city of Lenexa. We've also seen sales and use tax growth year over year. Increases in 22 were at 15%, and for 23 they're tracking about 10% over 22. We've also seen strong consumer demand for products and services, and along with that, a very hot labor market. Compensation and benefits have been dramatically increased over the last couple of years as cities, local governments compete with businesses to attract and retain good employees. Looking forward, we're kind of in an uncertain economic time. Inflation remains elevated. It has come down from its highs from last year, but is still elevated. The Federal Reserve dramatically increased rates over the last couple of years, but recently has paused those rate increases, basically fearing that we're going to tip into a recession if they continued. We also see supply chain disruptions kind of lingering from COVID-19 pandemic and the shutdown. And then kind of new, first quarter of this year, we've seen potential for housing market contraction. Single family new building permits have decreased for the first time in several years. We use these budget principles to continue providing exceptional public services and maintaining a strong financial position. The first one is to fund ongoing operating expenditures with ongoing revenue sources. An example of this would be hiring a police officer or firefighter like we're doing in this fiscal year. We would use sales tax, property taxes, which are ongoing revenue sources to pay for those positions. We would not use one-time lump sum grant revenue or use of reserves for those type of expenditures. What we would use those one-time revenue sources for would be equipment, one-time purchases of vehicles, building reconstruction or new buildings. We also want to maintain sufficient reserve balances to address unforeseen events. COVID-19 is the most recent example of that, and then also the Great Recession just a little bit over a decade ago. As Becky mentioned, we use conservative approach to revenue estimating. It's always better to come in revenues to exceed our estimates than it is to come in less than our estimates and cause budgetary shortfalls. And then to budget for maintenance and equipment replacement, we prepare and fund equipment replacement building maintenance schedules. Key elements of the budget: it reduces the estimated property tax rate by 0.75 mils to 27.372 in fiscal year 24. That's split between two funds. The general fund, the mill rate is estimated at 22.339 mils, and debt service fund is just over 5. As you can see there, we plan an additional half mil reduction in debt service fund in fiscal year 25. In fiscal year 26, just over a third of a mil reduction. A couple years ago, Council wanted to shoot for a 26.5 mil target, and we had produced a plan that would get us there by fiscal year 27. With the increases in assessed valuation, we've been able to roll the mill back faster than anticipated. We should reach that 26.5 mil target by 2026. This budget also maintains sufficient general fund reserves for our AAA bond rating. It's the highest rating given to cities on their bonds. Also the uncertain economy that we may face going forward and that we've just recently talked about. It also continues to focus on providing high quality city services. To do that, we need to retain good employees, and we'll talk about some compensation budget here in a little bit. And also fund strategic priorities, whether that's community center renovation, adding new roads, redoing new roads, infrastructure, etc. And it also plans for economic pressures. We talked about the workforce pressure, inflation remaining elevated, and the potential for the recession economic downturn. At a high level, excluding reserves, the fiscal year 24 recommended expenditure budget is $154.3 million. That's an increase of $10.2 million or 7.1% over fiscal year 23. Included within that, the general fund operating expenditures for fiscal year 24 are just over $106 million. That's an increase of $9.2 million or 9.5% compared to fiscal year 23. Majority of that increase is for compensation that we'll get into in a little bit, and also for transfers to our capital improvement program. And as Becky noted, we're adding the 6.5 FTE for fiscal year 24. And I also note that stormwater service charge is remaining at $109 per equivalent dwelling unit, or EDU, which is unchanged from fiscal year 23. So there's some of the highlights. We'll look at the major revenue projections for our budget. We'll start with property taxes. And to do that, we need to talk a little bit about a piece of the equation, a big piece of the equation, assessed valuation. You can see a chart dating back to 2014 with the city's assessed valuation. For fiscal year 24, we anticipate an increase of assessed valuation by 8.8% to $1.72 billion. The other piece of the equation is our City of Lenexa's property tax rate. You can see this chart dates back to 2013. We had a 29.668 mill levy. We had our highest mill levy in 2018 at 31.832. And then for the last 5 years, we reduced that mill levy and anticipate reducing it for a sixth year in fiscal year 24 to 27.372. A couple years ago, the state legislature introduced the revenue neutral rate, and it's a conversation that we have each year and what we look at when we're developing our budget. The definition is the mill levy required to raise the same amount of property tax revenue as the prior year using current year assessed valuation amounts. So as your assessed valuation increases, your mill levy would decrease, and vice versa if your assessed valuation decreases. This does not take into account or allow cities, local governments to take into account new growth, of which our increase this year, $24.5 million, was due to new growth. It also doesn't include the inflationary numbers that we've seen the last couple of years, as high as 9% last year and right around 5 or 6% now in current year. To calculate the revenue neutral rate for our fiscal year 24 recommended budget, we're going to use the assessed valuation of $1.72 billion. And then a mill levy, using that assessed valuation, the mill levy to produce the same amount of revenue from last year, for this year, would be 25.858 mills. So what that would means is the 28.122 mills, our current year budget for fiscal year 23, we would have to reduce that mill levy by 2.264 mills to get to the revenue neutral rate in fiscal year 24. From the estimated fiscal year 24 revenue or mill levy of 27.372 mills, we would need to reduce it further by 1.5 mils to get to that revenue neutral rate. So what is the dollar value impact of those reductions? For our example here, 1 mill is $1.67 million in the fiscal year 24 recommended budget. So a reduction from the fiscal year 23 mill levy to the revenue neutral rate would be $3.8 million impact to the city. And then from our estimated fiscal year 24 mill levy to the revenue neutral rate would be an impact of $2.5 million. So all those are pieces of the property tax revenue that the city is seeing. The actual dollar value of the property taxes for fiscal year 24 will be about $45.7 million, or 5.8% increase. The city does assume a delinquency rate of 3%, and the property tax revenue would be split between two funds, the general fund at $37.3 million and the debt service fund of $8.4 million for fiscal year 24. Another major revenue source for the city is sales tax revenue. Estimated fiscal year 24 sales taxes are estimated to be $36.2 million in the general fund. That is city and county. The city does receive a portion of the county sales taxes based on a formula provided by the state. The increases for fiscal year 24, that's a 12.8% increase over fiscal year 23 budget of $32.1 million. Use tax revenue, fiscal year 24 use tax revenue in the general fund of $14.7 million. Again, that's city and county. That is up 15% from the fiscal year 23 original budget of $12.8 million. Motor vehicle excise tax, the county, Johnson County, and the state of Kansas provide us with these estimates. They're actually decreasing 5% for fiscal year 24 compared to fiscal year 23 original budget. That is mainly due to higher interest rates on motor vehicles and other types of vehicles. Stormwater service charge, as we mentioned, it remains at $109 per EDU. We are anticipating a 1% increase for fiscal year 24 to $6.46 million, as mainly due to new EDUs coming online in fiscal year 24. In total, our revenue budget is $154.3 million. Of that, non-property taxes, which include sales and use tax, are at $68.6 million, or 44.5% of our budget. Next largest is property taxes at 43.6% of our budget. Turning our attention to expenditure projections, we're first looking at our personnel costs. As I mentioned, the labor market has been really hot the last couple of years with large increases in wages and benefits. We've received direction from our city council not to fall behind on compensation and benefits. In order to not fall behind and remain competitive, we've included a 6% budget for compensation and increases and adjustments for fiscal year 24, 3% of which are already budgeted in the department budget pages, and then 3% which will be reserved in non-departmental. City contribution for employee health insurance increases are anticipated at 9%, or $630,000. That is up to $7.61 million in fiscal year 2024. And then again, we're adding the 6.5 FTE that was mentioned before. For contractual services, commodities, and capital outlay, contractual service and commodity expenditures are increasing by just over $1 million, or 6% for fiscal year 24. It's pretty much in line with inflation. We're seeing a lot of inflation in maintenance items, equipment, small equipment, and then capital outlay expenditures for fiscal year 24 are $690,000 compared to $730,000 fiscal year 23. That's a 4% decrease. This decrease is due to a lower number of requests for new vehicles and equipment in the fiscal year 24 budget. I did want to mention a couple lingering issues related to supply chain and inflation that we've seen since COVID. We talked about these last year at this time. Vendors are unable to deliver orders for years. That's particularly true in the fire department. When we've ordered a fire truck, fire apparatus, we may not see that for 3 years. We might not take delivery for about 3 years after order. Prices for goods and services remain elevated, mainly due to inflation, but also because there's a shortage of supplies and materials for a lot of these goods. Now, looking at our economic development and general fund transfers, our economic development payments include CID, neighborhood revitalization districts, special benefit districts, and our TIF districts. They are increasing about $300,000 for fiscal year 24, or 1.4%. That is all due to the addition of 3 new CIDs within our budget. Just a reminder, a majority of this revenue received in these funds are pass-through. They go to reimburse developers and are not necessarily revenue to the city. Looking at the general fund transfers to the capital improvement fund for capital projects, $1.7 million for fiscal year 24, which is a decrease of $600,000, which is a planned decrease. It went from about $1.5 million dedicated to this transfer to $1 million. And the general fund transfer to the CIF for pavement management program is $1.3 million, an increase of $100,000 or 8%. And then we have a general fund transfer to the equipment reserve fund. It remains flat in fiscal year 24. And then finally a general fund transfer to the rec center of $500,000. It was just over $900,000 in fiscal year 23. During COVID, we paused this transfer, and 23 was kind of a catch-up year, a transfer from the general fund to the rec center. In total, our capital expenditures are at $154.3 million. Again, public safety at $36.8 million is at 24% of the total, followed by economic development and community infrastructure. So each year, as part of our annual operating budget, we also develop a multi-year financial forecast. So basically current year, current budget year plus 4 more years, or 5 years total. Some of the financial model assumptions that we've taken are included in the model. Assessed valuation increase of about 9% for fiscal year 24, and then out years 25 through 28 at 4%. You can see our mill levy reductions there in 24 to 27.372 mills, another half mill reduction in 25, and then just over a third of a mill in 2026. Sales tax revenue is projected to have increase about 2% in 24 through 2028. Personnel, we've mentioned that we've included a 6% budget in the fiscal year 24 recommended budget. And then we have 4% increases for 2025 through 2028. General fund transfers to equipment reserve is $2 million through the life of the forecast. And then we have $3.3 million in general fund transfers to the capital improvement fund, pay-as-you-go type funding. And then in 2028, that number is $3.8 million. Looking at the general fund, fiscal year 24 through 2028, the fund is structurally balanced. In 2024, we're just over $106 million in revenue expenditures. By 2028, we're about $115 million. General fund reserve, in 2024, we're projected to be about 36%. And then it goes up to just under 37% by 2028. You can also see that our revenues are projected to increase from 2024 through 2028. As Becky mentioned, we ended fiscal year 22 in a strong financial position. Our general fund reserve balance was $43 million, or 43% of revenues. Staff is recommending that we transfer $8 million in excess general fund reserves and allocate those to the pavement reconstruction program, $5 million, and also just a transfer to capital improvement fund of $3 million, which will be allocated to projects later this year during our fiscal year 24 through 28 CIP process. Looking at the debt service fund, you can see the impacts of the mill levy rollbacks planned through 2026 as revenue decreases through 2026. But we're structurally balanced through the life of the forecast all 5 years. And fiscal year 24, we're at $14 million for revenues and expenditures, and by 2028, that is down to $13.1 million in revenues and just under $12 million in expenditures. Stormwater Fund, as we mentioned, we remain, the stormwater service charge remains flat at $109 per EDU. We are adding new EDUs each year. This fund is structurally balanced at just over $7 million in fiscal year 24 for revenues and expenditures, and $7.5 million in 2028 for revenue and expenditures. That gives you the overview of our fiscal year 24 recommended budget. The next steps, departments will present to the governing body on July 11th, a little bit more detail on each department's budget. And then I wanted to highlight the budget open house on August 17th. We would encourage the citizens of Lenexa to come and give us feedback and ask questions of city staff at that event.
And with that, that concludes our presentation for this evening. Thank you for your attention, and we would really welcome you to please share your feedback on the recommended 2024 budget by contacting us by email at budget@lenexa.com. Thank you.